government for the second time this year. He said the reappointment of Viktor Chernomyrdin as Prime Minister was because Russia needed a political heavyweight at the helm during its current economic crisis.
But Mr. Yeltsin's actions have done little to silence his critics in the Russian parliament. They're still calling for him to stand down and allow a coalition government to try to prevent complete economic collapse. Here's our Moscow correspondent, Mark Webster.
Warmly welcomed back to the Kremlin today, the man shown the door by President Yeltsin just 5 months ago because he'd failed to tackle Russia's growing economic and political crisis. Observers said it smacked of a desperate gamble by an ailing Boris Yeltsin, whose grip on power and sometimes reality has looked decidedly shaky lately. In a broadcast to the nation, he tried to justify this game of political musical chairs.
What is needed is an experienced and heavyweight politician like Chernomyrdin.
For the outgoing Prime Minister, 36-year-old Sergei Kirienko, it's been a rude awakening to the bewildering world of Russian politics and the uncertain state of the president's mind. Overnight, Mr. Kirienko paid his first visit to striking miners, camped outside his office for months to protest at not being paid. He told them he could now sympathize since he was unemployed himself. Opposition parties said they were glad to see him go, but repeated their criticism of Mr. Yeltsin. The communist leader said as long as Yeltsin remains in power, no amount of reshuffling will lead the country out of crisis. Russia's financial markets, dizzy with the events of the past few weeks, including the devaluation of the currency, are paralyzed. This time last year, 300 brokers were at work here. Today, there were only 5. It's a measure of the uncertainty as Russia holds its breath. Mark Webster, ITN, Moscow.
Financial markets around the world are bracing themselves for the effects of the Russian economic crisis. There are fears it could be the latest ingredient in a recipe for future global recession. Last Friday, shares in Britain fell by a massive 200 points in one day, but they have recovered today. Our economics editor Caroline Kerr reports.
In spite of concerns about the political crisis in Russia, the city appeared calm this morning, and shares even made a modest recovery. But the underlying mood is jittery, and traders are bracing themselves for a volatile week, as British and European investors are faced with Russia's refusal to pay its debts.
Well, Russia's a big problem, and European banks have considerable exposure in terms of bank lending to Russia. Clearly, the devaluation of the ruble and the problems relating to the financing of Russia's debt will remain problems in the months ahead.
Increasingly, there are fears about a global crisis. On Friday, the stock market tumbled amid concerns that the financial crisis in Asia was spreading to Latin America. And overnight in Tokyo, there was a sharp fall for the Japanese markets as the stock exchange plunged more than 2%.
I think there's a huge amount of nervousness at the moment. It's not just about Russia, it's about the global situation. It's about the fragility of European stock markets, fragility of the US market, concerns that maybe the economy is showing the early signs of tipping into some kind of global recession.
So we can expect a roller coaster week in the markets. What's unclear is just how serious the situation has become. Some analysts believe the market is still fundamentally sound, but others are already talking about falling confidence snowballing into a global crash. Caroline Kerr, ITN, the city.
Well, back now to our correspondent, Mark Webster in Moscow. Mark, we've seen this financial crisis spreading from Asia to Moscow to Russia. Can it be prevented from spreading further west?
No, I don't think it can. I think it's already lapping at the shores of the West and Western banks in particular. I think there are 2 good reasons for this. First is, well, Russia isn't a particularly big economy anymore. It's been in decline since the collapse of the Soviet Union, and it is still shrinking today. The point about Russia is it's not alone. As you heard Caroline Kerr saying there, we're seeing the spread, a virus, if you like, spreading around the emerging markets of the world. We've seen it in Indonesia. We're now seeing it in places like Venezuela in South America. Now, if all those countries are affected, banks in the West have huge exposure, massive loans that they've made to them when times were better. Now they're going to start calling in those loans, and they don't have the money to pay. The second thing is, you saw all the civil disruption in Indonesia. Well, if you like, Russia is Indonesia with nuclear weapons. If that sort of civil unrest happened here, then quite clearly there's a very real concern in the West as to what might subsequently happen.
Now, of course, Boris Yeltsin and Viktor Chernomyrdin are the men who got them into that crisis. Can they get them out of it?
Well, it's a curious thing, isn't it? I mean, there's Viktor Chernomyrdin. He was the one, if you like, who for 5.5 years presided over the decline. Kirienko was in there just in time for the fall. I mean, the answer is no. There are only so many things they can do. You've got falling oil prices, which has obviously hit Russia extremely hard. You've got their inability to raise more tax revenue, which has meant, it's rather like you and me, we took out a huge mortgage, say,